to be reading from this book, Crisis of the Black Intellectual, which is very, very informative, and it really gives us a chance to listen to what our brother WRIGHT has to say. And I'm going to be reading just a few paragraphs at a time, or maybe a whole chapter. So I'm going to start in chapter 3. I'm going to kind of jump around a little bit. Romancing the Black Nationalist Stone. There are some facts about black history that must be emphasized that cannot be ignored logically, safely, or morally. The first is that black Africans were brought here as slaves. This was done over a period of about 230 years and equal the length of time of black chattel slavery in America, regarding slaves and thus black people as property. Second, black people are the descendants of the original black Africans and the black people that initially produced. In time, the black people continually produced what became the black ethnic group of North America. This development was also aided by the cultural and social life they created. In addition, it was assisted by the melting down of the various black ethnic groups that came to North America over the years. Interesting. See, that's where our thinking is being distorted at. We're not thinking in facts. We need to get back to the facts. The slaves were reduced to a single black people that slowly but steadily evolved into a single black people. Chattel slavery was involved in this process because it segregated and confined African and black slaves, helping to melt down the black Africans, and also facilitated black Africans and black slaves mating with each other. Now remember, listen to that. Black Africans and black slaves mating. Now let's see what happens with that. This ultimately produced black slaves and the black ethnic group. This ethnic status of black people would not be discernible to people until sizable numbers of black people from other parts of the world, such as the West Indies, South America, and Africa, came into the country during the early 20th century and onward. Clear and wide recognition and acceptance of this fact has yet to occur. Black nationalist thinking, at least in the way it was done by black intellectuals, was a great impediment to that understanding and acceptance, and continues to be. The third unassailable and important fact that has to be acknowledged and emphasized is that most black people who ever lived in America were born here. They did not grow up in Africa. They did not know it or its people, nor did they have ties to it or memories of the places. The black African who kept coming into the country by the early 18th century found themselves having no interact with black people who were evolving in the country. These American black people were constructing a life as slaves. Throughout this historical situation, there was considerable initial friction, not only because of the psychological and cultural differences, but because incoming black Africans had to be absorbed into the black way of life, which they resented and resisted, sometimes as much as they resented or resisted being transformed into chattel slaves. So we're looking at black Africans having to also become black in America and also had to become chattel slaves. This brings us to the fourth salient fact to acknowledge and emphasize. Black people grew up, made history, and developed a cultural and social life in a place far removed from Africa. The 350,000 to 400,000 black Africans that were brought to North America were their ancestral group, but they also had other ancestral group that would be even more important to them. Their black ancestral group. It is clear that the African ancestral group is the subject of Afrocentric CT, while the black ancestral group, based on the history they were making, the new cultural and social life they were creating and maintaining, and the new ethnic group they were establishing, inaugurated what I called black centricity. Black centricity. Wow. So that is really something, isn't it? What we didn't have to go through. Now, I'm going to read a little bit more. Nationalist ideology and distorted scholarship. However, black nationalist historian Sterling Stuckey does not see it that way. He argues in his book, Slave Culture, that black Africans who became slaves in North America remained Africans, even profoundly African, with an African consciousness that originated from Africa culture retentions, or Africanism and African culture. In the new environment, the slave environment, African culture traits had to undergo change in order to stay viable. That was what they did, and that was how some African culture traits were retained. The full title of Stuckey's book is Slave Culture, Nationalist Theory and the Foundations of Black America. But since the historian said that the chattel slaves of the English colonies and then of the United States remained African, his book should have been titled Foundations of African Americans. Indeed, Stuckey usually refers to black people in his book as African Americans. He talks of these Africans having an African nationality, which he said was inaugurated by the initial African slaves, and inserted this contention to the preface of his book when he stated, "The main argument set forth in chapter 1 is drawn from a consideration of how slaves responded to cultural challenges before them. That consideration led to the inescapable conclusion that the nationalism of the slave community was essential. African nationalism, consisting of values that bound slaves together and sustained them under brutal conditions of their oppressor and oppression. Their very effort to bridge these ethnic differences and to form themselves into a single people to meet the challenge of common foe proceeded with an impulse that was pan-African, that grew out of the concern for all Africans, as what was useful was appropriate from a multiplicity of African groups, even as an effort was made to eliminate distinctions among them. I find it impossible to see what nationalism has to do with the black African and black slaves of the United States, and still less what African nationalism and pan-Africanism has to do with them. Stuckey undermines, if not rents, his contentions when he employs the term African ethnicity with regard to black slaves. Now, it seems like my time is running out. I only got 15 minutes. So I'm just going to say this, that I'm going to continue in the next segment. I'm going to continue reading what Sterling Stuckey is making a point of in his book, Slave Culture, Nationalism, Theory, and Foundations of Black America. Now he goes on to say that it's a greatly ironic, therefore, that African ethnicity, an obstacle to African nationalism in the 20th century, was in this way the principal avenue to black unity in antebellum America. Okay. So, he is talking about how Africans were before the Civil War. Now, we're going to see the difference. We're going to find out how Africans evolved after the Civil War, and also what is happening now. Because you see, we have went through different evolvements, like what happened coming over here, how the Africans had to actually get out of their African state of mind, their culture, their ethnicity, and also their tribal traditions that they had. And we had to mix with other slave Africans, and then you had to get away from who you are and become what we call now African Americans. But I'm going to always consider myself as black. Not because of the color of my skin, but because my people were black Africans. Okay, I will be back with another segment of Crisis of the Black Intellectual. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, and please tune in for the next segment. Thank you.
This here is a remarkable So Deaf remix. J.E. y'all. Run DMC to the beach, y'all.